Good evening and welcome. In June of 1972, 50 years ago, Sally Priesand became the first woman to be ordained a rabbi in the United States. I'm Rabbi David Wazenika, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our Center for Jewish Life program that will give us an opportunity to both commemorate and to reflect on that moment. Before introducing our participants, if you have questions you would like to pose, there should be a Q&A button or something similar on your screen. I encourage you to feel free to write them in. And that said, it's my pleasure to introduce our two panelists. I'll begin with a familiar face to our congregation who needs little introduction to most of you. Rabbi Sari Laufer was ordained by Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Los Angeles in 2006. She had graduated cum laude from Northwestern, and during her studies at HUC, she was awarded academic prizes in Talmud and Rabbinic literature, as well as HUC's Outstanding Female Student Award. Prior to coming to Stephen Wise Temple about 5 years ago, she served Congregation Rodef Sholom in New York City. Of course, at Stephen Wise, she is our Director of Congregational Engagement and involved in many aspects of our congregation. She's married to Ben Cutter, and they are parents to Jacob and Orly, and I am very fortunate to call her my colleague, and it is a joy that I welcome her to this program. Our guest this evening is Rabbi Dr. Carole Balin, known for her fresh ideas, her authenticity, and her way with words. She is chair of the board of the Jewish Women's Archive and professor emerita of history at her alma mater, Hebrew Union College, where she was the first woman at the New York campus to earn tenure. Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Wellesley College, she earned a doctorate at Columbia University and speaks and publishes widely on gender and the Jewish experience. Rabbi Balin is currently writing a book about Bat Mitzvah, anchored in the stories of pioneering girls who sparked a gender revolution in Jewish life. Her expertise has informed NPR, the New York Times, The Forward, Huffington Post, Veller, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, and she's done podcasts as well. And finally, while not in her official biography, yet I think very important, Rabbi Dr. Carole Balin and I were classmates at Hebrew Union College in New York City. Frankly, I think, Carole, it should be in your biography, but I'll leave that up to you. And I have very fond memories of studying together, which makes this personally a very special evening for me, and very fortunate to welcome her this evening. And with that, Rabbis Laufer and Balin, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rabbi Wazenika. I will confess that hearing my bio read is probably one of my least favorite activities in the world, though I appreciate you doing that, Dave. But as you were reading it, I thought to myself, like, yes, this Outstanding Female Student Award hasn't been around that long. And I was thinking about that. And then Carole, as we were talking about your bio, and we had been talking earlier about your forthcoming book, right? This is a big year for American Jewish women's history in particular. Just 2 months ago, March 18th, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the first public bat mitzvah here in the United States at the Society for the Advancement of Judaism in New York City, right in my former neighborhood. And also, of course, we are preparing to celebrate 50 years of women's ordination. And so I'm excited to be here learning from one of my favorite teachers. I did not get to learn with Rabbi Balin in rabbinic school because she was on a different campus and we didn't have fancy technology like Zoom, but we get to learn with her tonight. And so I'm going to turn it over to you to give us a little bit of an overview, tell us sort of how we got to 1972, and then you and I hopefully will get to talk a little bit about what has happened since.
Thank you. Thank you both for those lovely introductions. It's really nice to be with you all tonight, especially with a former classmate and a former down the street colleague. We are Upper West Side sisters, so it's really nice to be here. And this topic is very close to my heart, as you can imagine, 50 years of women in the Rabbinate. So let me share my screen. I want to, let's see. Let me just, there we go. So the topic at hand, 50 years of women in the Rabbinate. I want to take us back beyond 50 years, actually, and talk about some of our other foremothers, that is, other women who entered the Rabbinate or nearly entered the Rabbinate or were considered rabbis in their day. We will get to Sally Priesand, who, of course, was the first woman to be ordained by a seminary officially, and the first in the United States. But before we do, let's start with some of the foremothers. So let's just see. So here we have what we call before Sally. Those of us who followed in Sally's footsteps, Sally Priesand, the first woman rabbi in 1972, we call the eras different than BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, Common Era. We call it before Sally and since Sally, or after Sally. So I want to introduce you to three women who trod the path before Sally did herself. The first is Ray Frank. Now, Ray Frank was born in 1861. She's your northern neighbor of San Francisco. She was a newspaper reporter. And one evening in 1890, in the fall, she arrived to Spokane, Washington, and realized that there was no high holiday service being planned. And she was appalled by this. She was a columnist, as I said, and quite a good writer, and had a Jewish, somewhat of some mastery of Jewish knowledge. And she said to the local community in Spokane, Washington, probably all of, under 100 folks, if you get a social hall together, if you get a place together, I will preach. And she did. And so she's known as Ray Frank. They called her the girl rabbi of the Golden West. And in 1890, she was the first American woman that we know of, a first American Jewish woman to preach at a service. And it was not just Shabbat, as I said, it was the high holidays. She did such a good job at Rosh Hashanah that they brought her back for Yom Kippur. So here we have Ray Frank, rabbi in quotes, girl rabbi of the Golden West, which was written up in the press. There's a great interest, and I will talk about this as we go through some of these other women. The press gloms onto these firsts. And this is the case as well with Martha Newmark. This is actually a copy of a newspaper article that appeared in the Lawrence, Kansas Daily Journal on the 25th of December, 1920 in Lawrence, Kansas. You'll note this was a big talk of mine a couple years ago, but 1920 was, in December of 1920, was just a couple months or a few months after women got the vote, earned the vote, won the vote in the United States. That is, white women in particular. It took women of color many more years after that. But with the passage of the suffrage amendment, the last ratifying state was Tennessee. And Martha Newmark knew as she grew older that she would get the vote. So Martha Newmark, it turns out, entered Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. This was in 1918, 1917. She felt called to the rabbinate. She talks about, she has a very short autobiography, but she talks about at her confirmation ceremony, which took place, by the way, when she was 13 years old, not 15 or 16 as it is today. I'm sure probably is at Stephen Wise. At the age of 13, she was reading Torah for a confirmation ceremony, and she felt this sort of spirit come over her, and she thought, I want to serve the Jewish people. And she decided in that moment she wanted to become a rabbi. So she entered Hebrew Union College. At the time, it was an 8-year program. She was not the first girl to enter Hebrew Union College, which is today the Reform Movement Seminary to this day. It joined with the Jewish Institute of Religion in New York. It merged in 1950, but in her day, it was Hebrew Union College. And she was very familiar with Hebrew Union College. Why? Her father, David Newmark, was a professor of philosophy. So after she had this feeling come over her, she knew from her own backyard of Hebrew Union College. She applied. She entered as a regular student just to study Jewish studies. In her 6th year of study, all her classmates, male classmates, were going off to be part-time temporary rabbis for the high holidays around the country, especially in the Midwest. And she made a request to the faculty that she be allowed to do this as well. The faculty voted, and they said yes. Well, at that point, the then president of the college, Kaufman Kohler, remember her father's colleague, right? Her father was a professor there, said, you know what, let's vet it with the rabbis in the field. Let's make sure that this is okay with them. Sure enough, the rabbis met that year in 1922 in actually Atlantic City, where they held their annual conference in the summer, and they voted 56-11 to allow her to be ordained as a rabbi eventually. It boomeranged back to the Board of Governors at Hebrew Union College, and they nixed it. So Martha Newmark not only did not serve a high holiday congregation, but she was never ordained a rabbi, and she came out with a degree in religious school superintendentship. So Martha Newmark was not allowed to become a rabbi, but what is very important about the history of her period is that the rabbis, Reform rabbis of America, went on record saying that they saw no reason why a woman could not be ordained a rabbi. It did take, however, 50 years for the first woman to be ordained from Hebrew Union College. In the interim, Regina Jonas, who's pictured here, German woman born in 1902, she went to school in Jewish studies in Berlin, and she was given private ordination in 1935, about 9 years before she perished in Auschwitz. She was first deported to Theresienstadt and then to Auschwitz, where she died. And nobody knew about the fact that she'd been ordained privately, meaning one person, one rabbi, ordained her in a private ceremony in what's known as smicha, ordination. And after the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, a couple scholars went into the archives in East Berlin, behind the wall, what used to be the wall, and they found her archives. And so it came to light only in the 1990s that there had been a woman who had really preceded Sally Priesand. So for many years, about 20 years, Sally Priesand, who I'll be discussing in just a moment, the first woman rabbi in the United States, was known as the first woman in the world to become a rabbi. But in fact, we do now have archival evidence proving that Regina Jonas preceded Sally Priesand. Regina Jonas, even when she was deported to Theresienstadt, we know, did act as a rabbi pastorally. She consoled people, she comforted people, and she gave weekly lectures. We know that from people who did survive Theresienstadt. She was deported, as I said, to Auschwitz and died in 1944. So it came on June 3rd, 1972, that Sally Priesand, and you see her amid her 35 classmates and faculty members at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, she was ordained. Sally Priesand decided when she was 16 years old that she wanted to become a rabbi. She had no female role models. There were no female professors at HUC, Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. There was an occasional religious school teacher who was a woman she knew of course, but she really had no context for this. This was in 1963. She told her parents at the age of 16, I want to become a rabbi. This was before Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique came out. I mean, this predates, in other words, the women's liberation movement that emerges in this country, or what's known as second wave feminism, first wave feminism being the time of the suffragists at the turn of the century and into 1922. So Sally decides, I want to be a rabbi. And she doesn't even give it a second thought. The fact that she's a woman, she's just determined to do this. So as a sophomore in high school, she writes a letter to Hebrew Union College. And she says, you know, I have this aspiration, may I apply? She gets a note back from the vice provost at the time, and he says, there's no reason why you can't apply, but I have to warn you that, you know, we don't know how this is going to fly out in the world. Will you get a job? We don't know, but, you know, sort of enter at your own risk. And he did say in that letter as well, you know, many women who are interested in this field go on to education. Sally was not deterred. She enters HUC, really University of Cincinnati, which at the time had a kind of joint program with HUC, where you'd go 4 years at University of Cincinnati as an undergrad, and then then you would take 4 years and enter Hebrew Union College for a total of 8 years. In her 4th year at University of Cincinnati, she was accepted to HUC without any kind of fanfare, without any kind of glitches. She in fact told me, I interviewed her about a year ago. She told me that she didn't even have to interview. It was just sort of a fait accompli. And her champion was really Nelson Glick, who was the president of HUC at the time. So Sally is ordained in 1972. She has 35 male classmates. And when she is called up to the Bema to receive her ordination and receive the special prayer from the then president of HUC, who's pictured here at the far right, her 35 male classmates spontaneously rise to their feet to acknowledge her feat. It's really quite a sensation, as you can imagine. It's picked up by every national media outlet at the time, Time Magazine, Look Magazine, the New York Times. She's interviewed by Frank Reynolds on ABC News. We actually, the clip of that, if I had more time, you know, I would bring that to you. It's really wonderful. And here she is with her long hair and her mini skirts. And she becomes the first woman rabbi in the United States and the first woman rabbi worldwide to be ordained by a seminary. She enters the rabbinate, she enters the job search. She is the last of her class of 36 to land a job. And she lands a job in New York City at Stephen Wise Free Synagogue, your New York cousin. And she is hired as an assistant rabbi, is promoted to become an associate rabbi. And eventually Edward Klein, the senior rabbi at the time, suffers a stroke. And before he does, he basically kind of anoints her. He assumes she'll become the senior rabbi. And that didn't happen. When Rabbi Priesand entered the search, the congregation was just not ready to take on a senior rabbi. And when she hears of this, she actually resigns her position and she enters the job market once again. And it takes her a good 2 years to land a job. So the message here being, there are women rabbis, but unless they're integrated right into the workforce, just like female lawyers, female doctors, what have you, it takes time. And even in these 50 years since, we're still working to have gender parity in the rabbinate. I brought this for you. It's one of my favorite artifacts from Sally of the era. So this is a super sister card. There was a young girl from upstate New York. Her name was Melissa, and she was an 8-year-old baseball card collector. And she one day said to her mom, you know, Mom, why aren't there any pictures of girls? And this incentivized Melissa's mother, Lois, and Lois's sister to create a deck of cards known as what you see here, the Super Sister cards. They created a series of 72 cards. They are reissuing them in this 50th anniversary year. Sally, as you'll see here, she's number 6. Rabbi Priesand is number 6. And Sally explained to me that's only because she was the 6th woman that they contacted to respond. They sent out letters to all these women firsts. Susie Chaffee, who was the Olympic skier at the time, who went on to make those chapstick commercials. I might be dating myself here. Gloria Steinem had a card, Rosa Parks had a card, Helen Reddy, the musician who, you know, sang that I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar, Margaret Mead, the famous anthropologist, Shirley Chisholm, who of course ran first Black woman to run for president. They all got cards. And this is Sally's card. And when I found out about this, I have to admit, I'm a groupie, and I went on eBay, and for $5.86, I bought my very own card. So just again, that publicity, that sort of exotic nature, this kind of alien notion of there being a woman rabbi. And you speak to any woman rabbi today, any female rabbi, and she will have stories to tell you. People asking, oh, can you be married? Can you have kids? Oh, what do you call your husband? We could go on and on, right, Sari? There's loads and loads of comments. This is from the 1980s. There's not a gush of women rabbis all of a sudden, but little by little, the numbers start to increase. I have here 1985 on my timeline because Rabbi Amy Eilberg is ordained by the conservative movement in 1985. I do want to mention also that the Reconstructionist movement ordains its first woman in 1974, 2 years after Reform. So it goes Reform, Reconstructionist. Here you have conservative. And you see here also, these are two of my favorite illustrations. The one on the left is from 1981. I don't know if you can see the writing on the wall here, so to speak, but it says, will you look like this when you're a rabbi? This is from a rabbi named Barbara Goldman Wartell. It's interesting. She has a hyphenated name, which, again, shows her era in some ways. Barbara's nephew, Andrew, drew this picture when Barbara herself, his aunt was in rabbinical school. This is from she was in 1980-81. So I just love this. This is from the 1990s, a series of pictures. You see on the far left, 1992, the first woman in Israel is ordained a rabbi. This is Naama Kelman. She comes from a rabbinic family, something like 7 generations of rabbis on both sides of her family. She is an American who makes Aliyah, known as an Olah. So she is not the first Sabra, the first Israeli-born woman to become a rabbi. That achievement goes to Hir Maya Leibovich in 1993. In 1994, this is a picture taken by Rabbi Debbie Zecker. Rabbi Debbie Zecker has a sister, Elaine Zecker, who's also a rabbi. They're probably the first sisters that I know of, at least, to become, both of whom become rabbis, obviously in different years, though there are actually triplet rabbis now, female rabbis, out in the Reform world. So this is Debbie Zecker, and I brought this picture because it shows that delicate balance between work and family that we parents in any kind of profession feel. And this is Debbie with her daughter Miriam. And Debbie told me, this is Debbie quoting, "I felt comfortable holding Miriam while I led worship, which was great for me, ideal for her, and a good model for the congregation that I could be both mom and rabbi at the same time." Well, if you'll notice Miriam's fist and arm here, she's kind of bracing, sort of fencing in her mother. And it turns out, Debbie told me, Miriam said years later that she had raised her arm in a defensive posture because she was protecting me from all the other kids who wanted my attention. So this is a very poignant image to me. I do want to point out this hair in the right-hand bottom corner. Turns out that young woman whose hair you see is Rachel Maimon, who became very good friends with Debbie Zecker's older son, and Rachel Maimon herself became a rabbi in the 2000s. And is now, for years, was working in Lexington, Massachusetts, and has made a career in the Rabbinate. So there's just a lot embedded in this one photograph. Go to the next one. In the 2000s, and just to, we live in them, I want to point out in 2005, this is a picture from Rabbi Robin Nafshi, and she talks about the fact that she married a cantorial student, a female cantorial student. They're a married couple now living in New Hampshire. And Robin talks about the joy in doing same-sex marriages and the joy in being able to be an openly gay woman while at HUC and beyond. In 2009, here, Sarah Hurwitz, she's the first Orthodox woman to be ordained. There are, in fact, about 53, 54 Orthodox women rabbis who have gone through seminary known as Yeshivat Maharat. There are more than that, in that some have been privately ordained, but in terms of seminary ordained, we have now over 50 Orthodox women rabbis, which is astounding and kind of a little known fact that I find people in liberal Judaism are not aware of. So we started with a trickle, and we're really flooding the world now with female rabbis. I want to point out in 2022, just this past May, for the first time ever in its 147 years, HUC-JIR issued a non-binary ordination certificate, meaning a person who does not consider themselves either male or female or neither or both. But in other words, Hebrew, as you may know, is a gendered language, like Spanish, like Russian, Italian, and there are no neutral tenses. There's no word in Hebrew, for example, for child. You say yeled, which means boy, or yelda, which means girl. There's no neutral word. There is for parents, but not for other gender-free nouns. So HUC crafted a non-binary ordination. I have not seen it. I don't know what exact language they use. I don't know if they defer to third person plural, like we do with pronouns they, theirs. I'm not sure, but it happened in less than a month ago. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but I did want to provide you with that overview so you have a sense of the larger history and background of women rabbis. I just want to take a second. I just have to plug in. It looks like my computer's running low. So this never happened, but I have my plug right here. Excuse me 1 second.
That's fine. I'm going to talk for a minute and just remind people that if you have questions, there's a Q&A box and you should be able to add them in. And I'm going to thank Carol as she's plugging in for that great slideshow. In some ways, a lot of that history I think is very much baked into me. And some of it I actually didn't know. I knew about Ray Frank, though I would like that title to be mine. Maybe not girl rabbi, but I really like Lady Rabbi of the Golden West. I would be okay with being given that title. And I knew about, I never pronounced her name correctly, but
Jonas.
Yes, but I did not know about Martha Newmark. So that was a little known fact for me, and I'm happy to have learned it. And I will just share, I have some questions for you, Carol, but I will share that this is I'm pulling back the curtain. At rabbinic conventions, there's a breakfast every year at the convention where they do a roll call. And so I actually think they start with the farthest back year that they know there's people registered, and the members of that class stand up. And it's pretty remarkable because my father-in-law, I want to say, was ordained in 65, 64, somewhere in that zone, maybe a little bit before that. Don't tell him I didn't know. And, so assume that the roll call usually starts somewhere in the 1960s, because my father-in-law is getting older. So, and it is men all standing up. And then every year, every time I've been at a rabbinic conference, when they get to 1972, and Sally is very often at these conferences, and she stands up, and in some ways similar to that ordination, the room sort of erupts, because there is, I think it's still, I don't have words for what it means to still have your firsts there, embodied, right? Not like a picture on a wall from the old timey times, but there and present. And so, I want to just acknowledge that it's always a powerful moment for me. And I think probably always will be, to see that. And then each of the years after, like you said, it's one or two and then more. So here's the first question, and you actually touched on a number of my questions, but I was thinking about that time between Martha Newmark and Sally, or Rabbi Priesand, and you sort of touched on the timing, right? So 1972, we are, ironically, I don't know if ironic is the right word, sadly, pre-Roe, right? And we are, it's sort of prime ERA era feminism, right? Exactly in that second wave, Gloria Steinem, Betty Friedan feminism. And I'm curious, what what, if any, impact do you think sort of that part of the cultural zeitgeist had on Rabbi Priesand's timing?
So, as my professor, when I was getting my PhD, used to say, this is the meteorological analysis of Jewish history. It was in the air. And I do think it was in the air in the same way Martha Newmark, she enters HUC and she asked the question just, 2 years after women get the vote in the same way. It's a little early with Sally. That's what's so remarkable, that already in the 60s, she's already thinking about becoming a rabbi. But I don't think she's alone probably in imagining herself as a rabbi, but she does it. So I wonder how many other young women out there were thinking about it, right, and did not. So I think for sure that has an impact. 1972 is important in so many ways. It's, also Ms. Magazine is founded in that year, founded not just by Gloria Steinem, who actually had a Jewish grandmother who was involved in the suffragist movement, by the way, but Letty Cotton Pogrebin, who was, very visibly Jewish. So I think it's in the air. I will say too, Sally had a champion in Nelson Glick, the president of HUC, and the other champion for women rabbis in that 50-year gap between Martha Newmark and Sally actually becoming a rabbi, but in principle versus reality, is Jane Evans, who was the first executive director of what was then known as the National Foundation of Temple Sisterhood, which now is known as the Women of Reform Judaism. But there might be folks out there watching who are either familiar with sisterhood or part of sisterhood. And sisterhood from very early on championed the idea of there being women rabbis. Jane Evans got up in front of 1,600 people at one of the biennials, the national biennials of the Reform movement, where thousands of people attend. And she advocated, she said there should be women rabbis. And, if not for people like her, who already was, acting in the role of a leader, it probably wouldn't have happened. 72 is kind of early in the second wave feminism, right? But for sure, I think for sure it was the zeitgeist, it was in the air. It's part of understanding history.
Thank you. I got to know, I was lucky enough to know Jane later in her life. And I can absolutely write. There's nothing about that I can't imagine. And I should say for the people on this call that the Women of Reform Judaism continue both financially and sort of emotionally and spiritually are huge supporters and advocates and champions of female identifying rabbinic students. They, with scholarships and educational opportunities and things like that. So I want to give Jane.
Yeah, we could go on and on. They built the dorm in Cincinnati. Right. They helped move the headquarters of the Reform movement from Cincinnati to New York on Fifth Avenue at the time. Just remarkable. So yeah, it takes a village, for all these big things to happen.
So I have a giant question that I want to ask you. And then I have a couple that I think are sort of under that umbrella, but I'm going to ask the giant question and then maybe go back to some of the other ones. But 50 years, we're all gearing up to celebrate. I've actually spent the last several days editing videos for the celebration. We're planning our own on June 3rd on our Bima. How do you think women have changed the American rabbinate? That's the giant question. And I was glad that you brought Rabbi Eilberg and Rabbi Sarah and, because it's not just the Reform rabbinate, right? I think it's actually, I would say the American rabbinate and American Judaism.
It's a great question and it's a big question. I'll start to answer it and you just stop me if I go on too long. But the two main verbs I would use is humanizing the rabbinate and democratizing the rabbinate. So humanizing, you don't get any more human than having a female rabbi on the Bima who's pregnant, right? And it changes everything. On the one hand, it changes nothing, but on the other, it changes everything. In other words, I think it brings clergy down to earth in a good way. I think it makes people feel more relatable, a rabbi more relatable to congregants. Not that there aren't male rabbis who are relatable for sure. We saw an example earlier tonight with Rabbi Woznicka and his sense of humor and his personality and all the rest. But there's something very embodied, very physical, very visible about having a woman on the Bima. which leads to the democratization, meaning in a literal way, like not only can men do this, but women can do it, right? If I hear women leading prayer services, I mean, I'll never forget the first time I led a service when I was in rabbinical school. I was in a tiny, tiny town in Ohio, and I was the only one. I had no cantor, nothing. My husband helped me; he read Haftorah, but I chanted Kol Nidre, and I'll never forget someone coming over to older woman coming over to me afterwards and saying, "Oh my God, I never heard Kol Nidre that way." Coming from a female's voice, like, what did that mean? How did it penetrate the soul in a different way? It freed up access in some people's minds, at least, even though they might have had access before, but they felt more entitled to take that road, to study Talmud, to study the prayers, to learn Hebrew in ways that, they had not felt entitled to or privileged to before. I think it also, the Judaism, as I don't have to rehearse this, is such a gendered religion and culture, whereby, for example, on Friday nights, who lit candles, right? Women did, and who usually, stereotypically led the Kiddush, men did. Well, that's all been turned on its head, so there's role models, there's this gender differentiation. So I don't think we're there yet in terms of gender equity, and I can talk more about that if you'd like. But the main things are that and the democracy. And I want to say one other thing, and that is just about success. I think by women entering the rabbinate and it's changed. It's changing in some marriages and some partnerships, but generally speaking, thinking of women as the primary parent, right? Though that, as I said, that is changing. But what that did is it also changed what it means to be a success in life, right? It's not all maybe necessarily about getting the big job. I mean, it's, sort of creating a life for yourself where you're doing, wearing lots of hats and doing lots of different things. And I think that's had an effect on male rabbis. I think male rabbis have been rethinking since Sally's entry into the rabbinate, and certainly since many, many more numbers of women rabbis in the 90s, and I was ordained in 91, into the 2000s. I think it's giving men and women pause about how they measure professional success. And again, it's corollaries in the legal field and in the medical field and every other field you can imagine, but same too in the rabbinate.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just listening. There was an interview with a comedian who recorded a comedy special when she was like 6 weeks postpartum or something. That to me, I was like, whoa. But she was talking about how when originally she was supposed to film it when she was, 7 or 8 months pregnant. And she sort of said like, Ali Wong just did it. Like, is it too much with the pregnant comedy special? And she said, and I thought this was interesting, sort of speaking about like the humanizing and the embodiment that women have brought to the rabbinate, that she said, there are lots of men who have also done pregnant comedy specials. We just don't know it, right? Because we can't see it. Meaning like their wives or partners or girlfriends, right, could be home expecting, but we don't know. And right. So like, it's an interesting thing. Like, I think about it in my own rabbinate, right. And, I know Rabbi Woznika's family, and they're wonderful and amazing. And, I know his children were very much part of the fabric of the synagogue as they were growing up, but there is something different of the, like, there's no escaping it, right. When it is in your body and embodied on the bima in that way.
Right. I think you're absolutely, and to see it, if you can see it, you can be it, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And the permission.
Though I also want to, and I don't know if this is a question, but, always interesting to me. And I know Sally has talked about it at length, that she did not mother children, or did not mother her own biological children. I think in lots of ways she mothered a lot of us, but, that is not something that she did in her personal life. And I sometimes wonder, is that, in that same question of how many other women, might have wanted to do what she did, I think there were probably some trade-offs for her in that.
Right. I think you're right. I mean, she speaks very publicly about this. She says that, she made a conscious decision not to get married and have children, or have children and get married, whichever way you want to look at it. But she felt that she needed to devote her entire being to this profession. Though I will say that, and she does say this publicly as well, that when she was in rabbinical school, she dated a rabbinical school student for a long while, and they did not marry, obviously. But she used to think about, having a nursery, with the baby, near her office, and sort of being involved in that child's life. But I think that the reality of what she faced in the job market, changed her perception. And, for sadness, for better, for worse, I can't speak for her, but, she made a commitment to this. I haven't done any sort of study about this. It would be interesting to see if other women firsts in different professions felt that same kind of inability, or just they didn't feel the permission to do that.
Yeah, it would be interesting. I'd be curious about that.
Partners at law firms and what they gave up, or what they, but men and women too. But it just becomes very pronounced for women, like you said, because you see it.
And also, and I say this always with love to my male colleagues, like, I just don't think that very often when they are at synagogue on a Friday night, they don't often get asked, like, oh, who's watching your children? Right? Like that, I think still, and this is, I am certainly not a first.
Right. 50 years later, right? And we're still thinking, yeah. Right. It's the society.
So someone actually just asked in the chat, and it's the direction I wanted to go anyway, about gender equity in the Rabbinate today. So you may have seen, I had a little bit of a kerfluffle with Women's Day magazine recently, or about Women's Day magazine, and when they named a male rabbi as their rabbi in residence. But the rabbi in question sort of incorrectly asserted that the majority of rabbis in the Reform movement today are women, and was quickly fact-checked by the journalist, who did note, though, that if not a majority, a significant number of recently ordained Reform rabbis in the last 5-10 years have been women. Like, is this good, bad, indifferent?
I could quote Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right? She was once asked, right?
I had my Ruth mug for my coffee. I felt like that was the energy I was bringing.
So, she famously said, she was asked, how many women would it take to have equality? How many women is enough on the Supreme Court? And she said, well, 9. Back in the day, people didn't say, well, how many men is enough? I don't mean to be flippant about it. I would say that there are still gaps. The most critical one that I can point to is concrete evidence. And a study was done about 2 years ago by the Women's Rabbinic Network, which represents Reform women rabbis, part of our larger professional rabbinic organization for Reform rabbis. And they found that there's an 18% gender wage gap between female rabbis and male rabbis. And it comes later on in the career. Usually people just being ordained, there seems to be equal pay at the assistant level, for example. This is for congregational rabbis, by the way. This is for Reform congregational rabbis. It's different in academia. It's different in other organizational life. But that's a wide gap. Right, 18% means 82 cents on the dollar for a man's earnings. Also, there's lots of questions still about parental leave. We don't have a across the board policy that's been normalized and that's being used everywhere. It's sort of still a case-by-case basis, which of course, doesn't get the same sort of results as if there's a standard policy across the board. So those are just 2 examples. I'm not in fear of there not being enough male role models or male rabbis out there. I don't see it happening. I think men are still entering the rabbinate. If anything, it's sort of the whole question of gender that's sort of upending things and forcing into new questions. The fact that HUC, the oldest seminary in the country, Jewish seminary in the country, has created now a non-binary ordination certificate. That means it's penetrating, right? This whole new idea of what gender is. In general, I don't think gender is going to fall by the wayside by any stretch, but it's just opening up our minds to different ways of expressing.
Yeah, I'm so curious now because with the various studies that have come out of our movement, I think a number of us female identifying rabbis were very surprised to discover that our ordination certificate actually doesn't read the same as our male colleagues. I think a lot of us had always assumed it was just the female version. So I would actually be super curious on the choice. I'll have to find, the choice that was made for a non-binary student.
Right. And they have corrected that. Of course, now people who are ordained
Right.
from HUC, male or female, get the same document with the same wording.
Yes.
But yeah, there were years.
I was one of those years.
Me too.
So I want to keep going on this. You talked about the wage gap and parental leave. I'm curious, like overall, as a historian and certainly a scholar of all this, like, do you feel like I'll ask about the Reform Rabbinate, but also because I don't think I can really speak to other ones. Like, do you think it is egalitarian, or are we not there yet?
We're getting there. I don't think it is. And I think it depends on each location, each synagogue, each community, every class. You know what I mean? It's this constant learning. I think that's happening. When I was at Hebrew Union College as a student, there were no female professors in the rabbinical school. When I thought about going on to get a Ph.D. and then coming back to teach at HUC, I had to imagine it. In the same way that Sally had to imagine a female rabbi. Now there's almost equal numbers of male and female professors at the seminary. So, even at that level. So, it's changing. I think it's just changing because society's changing and life's changing and more women are entering the rabbinate and more women are entering the workforce and, all those reasons. I think my daughter's 23. I mean, she has such a different understanding of gendered roles than I do. And, just in one generation, it's changing radically. My mother is 88, almost 85. She is, a whole other perspective. So I think it's, time does its work, and the role models keep churning out and people start to believe they can be what they want to be and express themselves the way they want to. So I don't think it's all gloomy. I mean, I'm a cup half full kind of gal anyway. Even in our lifetime, I mean, in just 50 years, when we see the remarkable changes that have happened in Judaism, I mean, in our life, I wouldn't have predicted myself when I was in rabbinical school in 1991, that there would be Orthodox female rabbis. I mean, that's astounding when you think about the strictures around women's participation in Jewish life from a Talmudic or a Jewish legal halach perspective. So it's astounding. It's astounding. And, different parts of the country, different parts of the world still, it's just, they're not living like the coasts, right? New York and LA, where we're so lucky to be.
I saw there was a question Dan asked about Rabbi Geller's appointment at Temple Emmanuel in Beverly Hills, like how, the prominence of that and what that, because she was the third woman ordained.
She was the third woman to be ordained a rabbi, and that she one day, became the senior rabbi at a major metropolitan synagogue was groundbreaking. And she was among the first, if not the first. But when you count up now, I mean, the numbers are growing, and it's again, the women are getting older, right? So these positions are, being filled by them. But yes, it was groundbreaking for sure. Rabbi Geller has written a lot about her experience, both as a student at HUC and after that, and what that meant for her. One of my favorite stories about women rabbis in 1978, 79. They were going to be there were only 7 or 8 women rabbis at the time, and their numbers had only just doubled. Like the year before, in 76, it was 3 women rabbis, and then it doubled to more than doubled. In 78, it became 7 women rabbis, something like that. And the Reform Rabbis organization was supposed to meet in Arizona and in Phoenix. And Arizona was a non-ratifying, non-ERA, Equal Rights Amendment ratifying state. I mean, the ERA was just ratified. I mean, it wasn't even but just finally got its 36 states it needed to be ratified just last year or so. Not that it's become an amendment, but anyway. So they were supposed to hold the convention in Arizona, and Laura Geller was one of those female rabbis. She and a cohort of 6 other women wrote to the leadership of the Reform Rabbis organization saying, we protest this. How can you hold a convention in a state that's not, accepting of us and accepting of women and Jews and, all the the Jewish values inherent in that or not in that. And so it turns out Laura Geller's younger brother, went to high school with a kid named Jonathan Priesand. And Lauren called Jonathan Priesand's mother, Betty Priesand, and asked her advice about what they ought to do about this convention. And Betty Priesand said, first of all, I consider you my spiritual sisters. Betty Priesand, of course, is Jewish, rarely talked about it. And Betty Priesand said, you go to that convention in Phoenix, and I'm coming, and we're going to hold a rump convention at the same time, and I'm going to speak, and we're going to hold our own rally. And she did, and they did. And the room where Betty Priesand presented was filled to the gills. You couldn't hold back the numbers of male and female rabbis. And the CCR, after the fact, wrote a letter. The head of the Reform Rabbis Organization, executive director, wrote a letter. Dear Ms. Priesand, inasmuch as you presented at our convention, here is a check for $750 for your honorarium. It's a little bit of rewriting history, but an acceptance of what had happened.
Yeah, wow, that's a good start. I'm wondering if we're going to have to start doing that again around all of these states with, anti-choice bills and anti-trans bills, right? Like, is the movement gonna respond to that?
I think so.
So I have, I think, one last question, and then, any closing thoughts from you. And again, I think you touched on this a little, but like, is there a next frontier, right? Either for women rabbis, like, is there a sort of Rubicon we need to cross? And for the American Rabbinate, right? Obviously we don't know who, but like, who do we think is the next Sally Priesand who comes forward and says?
Oh, I think the next frontier are non-binary rabbis of color, trans rabbis, though a little less so. It's sort of a more discrete kind of contained category, but for sure. And it's not to say that we don't already have rabbis of color, because we do. And we do have rabbis who are non-binary, we do, and rabbis who are trans, but we don't have them in the numbers. I don't know, just proportionately in the population, their numbers aren't as large. Though we're beginning to learn much more about Jews of color, of course. So I really think that's the next frontier. And what will that do to the rabbinate? What will that do to Judaism? What does it mean in terms of how we imagine God when we think of God as, non-gendered altogether, not just male, female, but, no gender at all. There's, of course, lots and lots of textual Jewish classical texts to point to give us metaphors for how to think of God in those terms. But I do think that's the next frontier.
Yeah, that's
and how it will play out. I don't know.
Well, thank you so much. We know it is late on your coast, and
we're energized though. It's been great.
I was like, it's my favorite topic. I could talk about it forever. But we really want to thank you. It's always a treat to learn from you. And now I told you I'm coming away with something I never knew about. So Martha Newmark. And for those of you, actually for anyone, if you are here in Los Angeles, we really do invite you in person on June 3rd, but anyone can join us online as we will be celebrating at WISE. Rabbi Priesand's momentous ordination. We'll be celebrating with a number of local female rabbis, including Leah Kroll, who served at Stephen Wise Temple for so many years, will be joining us, and Heather Miller, who grew up at Stephen Wise Temple, will be there, and a number of other local rabbis. And we hope it will be a meaningful celebration of really what this moment means, because on the one hand, it feels like 50 years, it's really an accomplishment. And it's also like the smallest drop of time in Jewish time and in Jewish history. So thank you, Carole, for staying up late with us. And thank you everyone for joining us. As always, if you have questions afterwards, feel free. I'm clearly happy to talk about this subject at length. And wishing you all a good week. I'm so used to saying Shabbat Shalom, but it turns out it is only Monday.
Thanks so much.